Reparations, a noun in Webster's dictionary. It means the making of amends for wrongs one has done by paying money to or otherwise helping those who have been wronged. There's a bill or a study to actually create a bill on reparations. Now, let's look at it. The Emmett Till bill has been introduced by one senator every year until he retired. Finally, 40 years after he retired, 100 years after its first introduction, it became a law. How long do we have to wait for reparations? Let's look at the true meaning of reparations and what has been happening in our history. And we're going to take care of that right after this break.
Two, one.
Okay, so we talked about reparations, and it's been a huge topic. Let's see. We've had some people who've had some crazy thoughts about reparations, but as you can see on a little streamer down there, is our phone number. So anytime you want, chime in. We'd like to hear what you got to say. So let's get into reparations. Now, reparations dates back to actually Napoleon. He was actually the first one. Following Napoleon's final loss at the Battle of Waterloo under the Paris Treaty in 1815, France was ordered to pay 700 million francs in indemnities. France was also paying additional money to cover the cost of providing additional defenses and fortifications to be built by the neighboring coalition countries. Then we go into the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, and the 1920 London Schedule payment required Germany to pay 132 billion gold marks. That comes close to somewhere around $42 billion today. Now, all values are contemporary unless otherwise stated in their agreement. Was it to be in gold? Yes, because of the fluctuating price of gold. Now, if you look at gold back then versus now, Germany would have been paying somewhere close to $3.5 trillion. A lot of money for reparations. Now, in reparations, it covered just the civilian damage to Germany alone during the war. Now, Germany made its final payment. Guess when? 1919 to, would you believe, October 3rd, 2010, Germany settled its last debt on reparations, 92 years to pay it off. Germany made more money in BMWs and could have paid it off sooner, but that's a whole nother story. Now, despite the protests of another reparations, the agreement was signed in September 1952. West Germany paid Israel a sum of 3 million marks. That is, and over the next 14 years, 450 million marks were paid to the World Jewish Congress. The payments were made to the state of Israel and to pay for their heirs, the surviving victims of the Holocaust. Right now, that would be somewhere close to $5 trillion. Were paid to them in 14 years. Now, look at another reparation story. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and it marked the U.S. official entrance into World War II. It also pushed the U.S. government legitimacy of anti-Asian settlement. Now, the anti-Asian sentiment back then is that they believe, out of no particular reason, that every Japanese citizen that in the United States was looking to overthrow our country. So, president of that time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he signed an executive order that authorized the incarcerating of Japanese descendants based on nothing but widespread suspicion, based on nothing but ignorance and fear, based on the belief of they were all espionage agents. Now, it didn't, but that didn't stop the war relocations from rounding up more than 100,000 people, 2/3 of whom were, U.S. citizens. I mean, U.S. citizens, either naturalization or, taking, of course, the oath of citizenship. 2/3 of them were U.S. citizens, sworn, knew American history more than most Americans. They still rounded them up and detained them in crowded barracks surrounded by barbed wires and fences. Now, in 1988, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 was actually signed August 1988, August 10th, and it was signed into law by none other than the Gipper. Yes, President Ronald Wilson Reagan. United States federal law granted the reparations to Japanese Americans who had been interned by the United States government during World War II. The act was sponsored by a California congressman by the name of Norman Matata. He was an internee as a child. Yeah, locked up as a child. Grew up, went to college, got elected, sponsored a bill of reparations, right? And signed into law by Ronald Reagan. And in fact, another senator from Wyoming, Republican, Alan K. Simpson, who had met this young man while visiting an intern camp that was still up. Now, the third sponsor of this bill was California Senator none other than Pete Wilson. Yes, Mr. I can't sign a bill. Oh, by the way, none of these people were able to sign the bill on the John Lewis Act or the Build Back Better plan. But they did sign for the Japanese internees and their descendants to get a reparation. The act was signed by Ronald Reagan. The act granted each survivor $20,000 in compensation. So we're talking $20,000, 1980 money, which means today that would be the equivalent of $140,000. Now, in 2020, they got their last payments. Now, it was signed in 1988. The payments began in 1990. Because, of course, some people had to appeal. The legislation stated that the government actions have been based on race, prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership as a response to the legitimate security reasons. A total of 82,219 received the redress checks. The most famous recipient of this check was George Tataki. Yeah, that's the picture of George Tataki, better known as Mr. Sulu. Now, World War II sparked a huge movement in the United States in terms of Americans wanting to undo their wrongs. Also, one of the biggest heroes of World War II, the Native Americans, over a century of colonizations and conquests, lost their land. They, during the period of World War II, um, had enlisted in the World War. They didn't really enlist as much as they were just dragged into World War II. Why? There were no Native Americans in Germany. They were what they called. There was a movie about them called the Cloud Whisperers. They did all the signaling, commanding, and orders over the air in Germany, and the Germans couldn't translate it. They were heroes of the World War II. We could not have gotten as far with the Germans knowing where we were. That was part of the intelligence game. Remember, they almost gave a Nobel Peace Prize to the mathematician, scientist who cracked the enigma. It was the code in which, when Germany would put their codes in over the air or send encoded messages, he built a machine called the Enigma to translate what they did. And it took him a long time to get it done. So imagine Germany trying to translate Native American language. Now, here's the thing. They didn't know which tribe either. But nevertheless, in 1946, Congress created the Indian Claims Commission, a body designated to hear historic grievances and compensate tribes for their loss of territory. Remember the story? Anybody did American history called the Trail of Tears? If anything was prevalent to Americans, settlers, colonizers, and their cruelty towards other human beings, it had to be one of the biggest was the way they treated the Native Americans. I mean, just stole their land and moved them to one location. And they, when they packed them up and moved them, they didn't, give them carts or anything like that. United States Cavalry rode horses, while the Native Americans who were evicted off of their land walked. That's why it's called the Trail of Tears. There were so many who have died from that process of moving to Wyoming and Arizona and a few of the other Indian reservations. Now, we're looking at, and now the commission did extensive historical research, right? And ended that the United States should pay them, awarding them in 1946, awarding them $1.3 billion, which is somewhere close to now 5 to 6 trillion. Yes, that money was supposed to go to 176 tribes and bands. The money was largely given to a group in which they distributed to them, and also gave them things which now is why you see on the Indian reservations, and one of the biggest businesses for Native Americans are casinos, because of that little bit of stipend of that 1.3 billion that they got. Now, for some tribes who members didn't live on a reservation, they basically took the money and distributed it into what was how would you call it? Trust fund. Now, here was the thing about the trust fund. Congress approved for the trust fund, right? And they had all of this money, because they only gave them a small portion to the actual Native Americans. The rest of it was in the trust fund, because all that money given to the Native Americans would have, of course, increased their wealth per Native American. We couldn't have that because they still considered them to be savages. So they thought they'd take their money and tuck it away until they reached a level of intellectual prowess to actually manage it. Still didn't give them their money. So the Native Americans took the United States to court, and initial agreement was outlined in 2009. approved by Congress finally a year later, 2010. And then spent another 2 years going through the appeal process. So they actually had to sue them for their money that they awarded them for their land that they took and made billions of dollars off of, and they got nothing. But now they got the settlement that they put in a trust fund that nobody can get. So it's in trust to who? So the final approval, called the Cobell settlement, it cleared the way for reconciliations between the trust beneficiaries and the federal government. This was signed by President Barack Obama. The settlement named after the late Eloise Cobell, a member of the Montana Blackfeet Indian tribe. The deal also followed the class action lawsuit, which was filed in 1996, which accused the United States Department of Interior of failing to account for and provide revenue from the trust, representing the value of the Indians' assets. So that big settlement money that they got, more than likely, they didn't get it all. Now, the missing funds at the center of the class action suit involved what was called the individual Indian money accounts, which were supposed to represent the property of the individual Indians. The account was held, and the United States was the trustee. Now, the cost and what they came with was somewhere missing, was somewhere close to $3.4 billion. That was just for the American Indians. We're going to talk about another reparation proposal right after this break. Okay, welcome back. I'm Vincent Squire. This is What You Got to Say, and the subject is reparations. Now, we talked about the mix up of all of that money for the Native Americans, um, totaling a mix up of money that they didn't get, totaling $3.4 billion, right? Okay, and that was the American Indians. Now, let's see. The French got reparations. The London got reparations from Germany. The Jews got reparations from Germany. The Japanese Americans got reparations from United States of America. Um, the Native Americans got reparations from United States of America. Now, 1865, an important day, the Emancipation or the end of slavery, which ended also the American Civil War. The war and the ratification of the 13 Amendments of the United States Constitution, which declared that neither slave nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crimes, wherefore the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subjected to their jurisdiction. At the time, there was an estimate of, we are looking at somewhere close to 4 million Africans, Americans that were set free. Now, also with that came what was called the Reconstruction Act. President Lincoln and his great think tank said that we are going to reconstruct the United States of America so that it can be inclusive and equal. And one thing that we're going to do is pay those people who the United States was built on off of their labor, better known as the freed slaves. Now, because of the Reconstruction measure, the law included the following. The South was divided into 5 military districts, and it was governed by the military, henceforth the term martial law, until acceptable states' constitutions could be written and improved by Congress. Now, that gives you the situation of what we call state rights. Everybody knows during the pandemic, every state governor ruled his actual state. And one of the big reasons that they had to actually rule and direct their states through the pandemic is because 45 was a complete putz. He didn't believe that the pandemic was here. Remember, everybody? It's going away. It's a Democratic hoax. There's no pandemic. Believe me. So that's an example of state rule. Now, because of state rule, all of the states who have separated from the Union, henceforth, the Confederate flag, each star, it represented those 13 states that crossed out the actual Union or being a member of the United States. That's the reason why the Confederate flag was never introduced into Congress or even the House of Congress. They brought it up for petition 3 times and it was shot down unanimously, one resulting in an actual senator being pummeled to death by another senator. However, that's another history lesson. But the states had to actually now put in their constitution to once again be a member of the United States. Now, new states' constitutions were required to provide for universal manhood suffrage, which basically means voting rights for all men without regard to race. States were required to ratify the 14th Amendment in order to be readmitted into the Union. Let's move back. And the biggest thing was called what every black person knows. 40 acres and a mule was to be given to every family of African descent who were forced into involuntary labor, better known as slavery. Yeah, let's see. So out of the actual 5 things in which they list to happen, we only got up to 4. Why? Didn't we get the part of the 40 acre and a mule? Oh, by the way, the 40 acre and a mule theory came to an actual Florida AME pastor who was a huge and strong member of the community, very strong leader. One of the generals came to him and said, what can be done to actually help rehabilitate and reconstruct the African Americans into American society? He said, well, what do you have? Well, there was a great deal of confiscated property owned by the slave owners their plantations and farms, which were acres across the Gulf Stream or the Gulf Coast from Florida leading all the way up to Maryland. So he said also what they can give them was some surplus army mules. They can use them for plowing. So they looked at all of the land and all of the out of the 4 million released or freed men and women. They looked at that and they said that it would be just enough for each family to receive 40 acres and they can get a mule. That's how that actually came to play. We didn't get that, that part of our reparations. Why? Well, the spearhead leader of the reparations was Abraham Lincoln. And when he got shot, there went the reparations. In fact, once he got shot, his vice president took over, who ran against him. That's the real term of vice president, against the president. So the vice president at that time was not appointed as we have today. The vice president was the second highest voter. So do you actually think that he voted or he was going to go and continue on the policies in which he was running to actually avoid? You're right. So 40 acres didn't happen. In fact, even the Reconstruction measures that took place for a lot of other people, he basically said, okay, it's over. The South, you deal with them. Yes, that's actually how it happened. And then in 1993, following a Abuja proclamation, declared that the first Pan-African Conference on reparations, Abuja, right? He organized this conference in Nigeria. And the conference was based upon African unity. And the Nigerian government, who was actually one of the biggest governments in terms of selling slaves, because free or cheap or easy labor at that particular time period during the 17th and 18th century, slavery was bigger than gold. Why? Because you needed actual laborers. So that's how it actually came into prominence. Then when it started ending in other countries, it started to flourish in the United States, which is why we were one of the last countries to abolish it, and it took a war to actually happen too. So in 1993, Benny Grant, right, tabled a motion at the House of Commons in Nigeria, and the House welcomed the proclamation and recognized that the proclamation was called upon on the international community to recognize the unprecedented moral debt owed to African people has not yet been paid, and urged all those countries who were enriched by enslavement and colonization to review their case for reparations to be paid to Africans, and the Africans in the diaspora acknowledge the continual painful economic and personal consequences that the exploitation of Africa and Africans in the diaspora, and the racism that has generated and support the international movement as it intensified its efforts to pursue the cause of reparation. The motion was sponsored by Benny Grant, Tony Benn, Tony Banks, John Austin Walker, Harry Barnes, and Jerry Bergman, in addition to 46 labor parties. Now, they signed this into support of the motion, including the leader of the opposition, which was a gentleman named Jeremy Corbyn. We'll talk about him, in a later date, because he was a real piece of work. Now, to use the lawful means to obtain reparations for the enslaved and the colonization of African people in Africa and their diaspora, right? This allowed lawful means to secure the returns of African artifacts also, which were placed and were currently held in white museums. some classic paintings of the Renaissance period were basically copies of these African artifacts. Now, but they wanted them to be returned. Also, they wanted to seek an apology from the Western governments for the enslavement and the colonization of African people, and to campaign for acknowledgement of the contribution of Africa to world history and world civilizations. All the technologies, and taking a trip to Africa, people were shocked, when you see all of the Western European people who, in their first trip to Africa, they're shocked to see that their castles made, and their castles predate the castles in Europe. They were shocked to see the actual architect and engineering made. I mean, as far as they know, the greatest engineering that happened in Africa was the pyramids. No, no. The African culture provided a great deal of intellect that the world still uses. Henceforth, vaccines was actually stolen from an African. But we'll do that one in another story. Now, also, the campaign was for accurate portrayal of African history and to restore dignity and self-respect to African people. Also, they wanted them to educate and inform African youth on the entire African diaspora for the great African culture, language, and civilizations. Now, Benny Grant was really on the move with this, right? Until 2000. The movement died because Benny Grant died. And the United Kingdom and their interest in it, it actually fell off and became inactive. Surprising to hear that Prince William was talking about the war, and he said that war is alien in Europe. I mean, you would expect to hear war in Africa and Asian countries. So the future king of England doesn't know history. I mean, England involved in the 100-Year War, England involved in colonization, England involved in actually giving arms and pitting one African group against another African group, and the survivors of them, they enslaved. But I digress. I guess that's why he wanted to know how dark Harry and Meghan's baby was going to be. But so anyway, in 2004, a controversial reparation lawyer by the name of Ed Fargan launched a class action lawsuit against the insurance marketer, big insurance giant. I mean, he was like Captain Ahab going after Moby Dick. He went after Lloyd's of London for their role in insuring slave ships involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Now, talk about going after the whale and being Captain Ahab. Well, it ended the same way for Ed Fargan. He lost the case. However, November 27th in 2006, British Prime Minister Tony Blair, the guy with the bad suit and crazy hair, yeah, he issued out a statement expressing deep sorrow for Britain's role in the slave trade, saying it's been profoundly shameful. Really? That's an apology? It was profoundly shameful? Yes, that's the equivalent of, kids today when they do something and you bring it to their attention, they just look at you and go, my bad. Really, Tony Blair, all of your education, you can just say, well, it was just profoundly shameful. The statement of course, was criticized by the reparation activists in Britain, one and Esther Stratford. And she stated that Tony Blair should have issued an apology of substance, which would also be followed by various reparative measures, including financial compensation. Well, once he heard that they were going after money, Tony Blair issued another apology in 2007, saying, after meeting with Guyana's president, John Kufuor, he says, you know what? We are very heartfully sorry for our role in the slave trade and the brutalization and robbing of society of its history. He still ain't write that check, though. Okay. However, the mayor of London, named Ken Livingstone, he did publicize an apology for London's role in the transatlantic slave trade during the commemoration of the 200th anniversary of the passing of the 1807 Slave Trade Act. Yes, 1807, British ended slavery. Yeah, yeah. Almost 90 years later is when America ended theirs. Yeah. In a speech, Livingston called on the British government to pass legislation to create a UK-wide annual Slavery Memorial Day, which would commemorate slavery. Still, no money. But this gets better, and we're going to find out how good it gets right after this break. Now, welcome back to What You Gotta Say. I'm Vincent Squire. Remember I said this reparation thing gets good? Okay, now, within the political sphere, a bill demanding slavery reparation has been opposed at the national level. The Commission to Study Reparation proposed for African Americans Act, which was formed by Republican John Connors Jr., a Democrat out of Michigan. He reintroduced this bill to study, not give money, to study reparations, right? He reintroduced this bill every year from 1989, at the year where they paid reparations to the descendants of Japan, or the Japanese Americans who they put in these encampments, right? Right after that, he introduced the bill, reparations for slavery, right? 1989. every year. He introduced this bill. It got shot down. He stopped introducing the bill in 2017. Why? He quit Congress. He found himself ineffective to actually bring change. So he left it up to someone else to do a better job than him. I wish a lot of other congressional members had that level of integrity. You know, those who have been doing nothing for years except for going to fundraisers, but do nothing for the people, but come back next election cycle to the fundraisers. Yeah, they need to quit too. But now we're talking about, you know, what? Wow, almost 30 years. Now, as the name suggested, the bill recommended the creation of a commission to study the impact of slavery on a social, political, and economic life of our nation. However, there are cities and institutions which have already initiated their own reparations in the United States in 1999. African American lawyer and activist Randall Robinson, who was founder of the Trans-African Advocacy Organization. He wrote that Americans' history of race riots, lynching, and institutional discrimination have resulted in a $1.4 trillion in loss for African Americans, which is true. I mean, we're talking what, 2022? The riots that happened in the 50s and 60s, some of these cities are just starting to get better. Now, 1.4 trillion in losses, right? Now, what happened after that? When you start talking trillions in 1990, you know, well, we lost the Congress after that. But the economist Robert Brown stated that the ultimate goal of reparations should be to restore the black communities to its economic position, and it would have it if it had been subjected to slavery and discrimination. Let's see, a black community in economic power and position. Let's see, Wilmington, North Carolina. That was when they had that movement called the Infusionists, which consisted of blacks and Jews in a community. Wilmington, North Carolina, during the post-construction period, where, you know, the government had left everything, wiped its hands of construction, this black community, which was basically founded by one man who purchased out of his own pocket 40 acres of land during the coast period. So they actually took care of the posts. Now, we're also talking about a time period where 79% of the black community voted. 79% during that time period. That community had 3 hotels. It had movie theaters. In fact, one of the hotels had over 100 rooms. So they were already in economic power. So what happened to them? Well, we had a group of people who got upset about that and tried to run them off of their land and take over their property. And they said no. Henceforth, one of the race riots in Wilmington, they basically got keys to the armory, got all of the military grade weapons, including a Gatling gun, and started killing blacks and Jews, burning their property down. And then after that, they built it up, and all of the property that was, you know, all of the owners that were dead, well, they took over that thriving community. Just think, looks like some people just don't want other people to be successful. And then when they are successful, they do everything that they possibly can to destroy it for no particular reason. But back to the economic study. Now, what he estimated was that a fair reparation value should be between 1.4 to 4.7 trillion dollars, roughly looking at the equivalent of today's value of $155,000 per person of color or per person of slave descent. So just think today, if the government was, when they gave out that stimulus check, yeah, that modern day government cheese. You remember when unemployment was at an all-time high, and people were going through all their unemployment issues, and Ronald Reagan solved their issues by giving everybody a block of cheese. Well, during COVID, Donald Trump gave everybody a block of cheese called that stimulus check, which got a whole lot of flat screen TVs. So if reparations at the level of $4.7 trillion, equating to $155,000 for every black person, Kim Kardashian would be turning black at that time. You find a whole lot of people, who, Confederate flag waving would be black about that time to get that check, okay? But for every black American living today, now, what they also found was that estimate range was too low. They finally agreed upon somewhere close to 5.7 to 14.2, or between 14.2 to 17.1 trillion dollars. That number came out roughly last year. $17.1 trillion. Wow. If we got that money and invested right, you know what United States of America would be? Wakanda! Now, but don't get me wrong, none of this great think tank goes unchallenged. In 2014, American journalist T. Nesty Coates published an article called "The Case for Reparation," which discussed the continued effects of the slavery and the Jim Crow. Also, how the Jim Crow laws, and putting that into motion, it placed a new demand for reparations. Coates makes reference to the late Congressman John Connors Jr. that said the aforementioned H.R. 40 bill, which he introduced every year until he retired, pointed out that Congress failed to pass the bill, expressing a lack of willingness to right their past wrongs. And not only did they fail to right their past wrongs, they don't even want you to teach their children about their past wrongs. The big thing now is that anybody who's against critical race theory and waving a "Make America Great Again" hat, can win an election. Because, there are people who are going through what's called white guilt, and they don't want their children to know what their great-great-great-granddaddy did. And they don't want their children to know, about redlining. They don't want their children to know why is there big fight on redistricting. They don't want their children to know why do they have better resources in their schools when this black kid doesn't have anything. Speaking of which, talk about resources. Cherry Hill, average budget per child, right? Upwards of $900 for the year per child. Cherry Hill. Next town over, going into the city of Camden, their budget per child in a school district, public school, right? $37. And they don't want their children to know why. passing the aforementioned H.R. 40 bill, which studies reparation proposal. But the work group did not directly endorse any of the specific reparation proposals. They're willing to study it, but they're not willing to give you that 17.1 trillion. The report noted that there exists a legacy of racial inequality in the United States, explaining that despite substantial changes since the end of the enforcement of Jim Crow and the fight for civil rights, the ideology ensuring the domination of one group over another continues to negatively impact the civil, political, economic, and social and cultural rights of African Americans today. We're going to finish this up, but I'm going to take a break. Welcome back. We're talking about reparations. Now, let's finish this. In September 2016, United Nations Work Group of Experts on People of African Descent encouraged Congress. Now, you wouldn't believe it, right? You would think, right? The United Nations would encourage Congress to pass the aforementioned H.R. 40 bill to study reparations proposals. The work group did not directly endorse any of the specifics in the reparation, right? But they do want them to pass it, right? Now, let's go. So, despite substantial changes, right, since the end of the enforcement of Jim Crow and the fight for civil rights, ideology ensuring that the domination of one group over another continues to negatively infect and impact the civil, political, economical, social, and cultural rights of African Americans today. Now, this is what the United Nations said, right? This is a group of people of diverse backgrounds in all other countries. This is what they put together and said to America without, the threat of being evicted because the United Nations headquarters is in America. They said that no, the report notes a dangerous ideology of white supremacy and inhibits social cohesion among the U.S. population. I mean, let's look at it. We got senators who proudly tell people that they're a member of the Klan. Now, the topic of reparation gained renewed attention in 2020. You know what happened in 2020 when they started killing black men? The police started killing black people and they started getting away with it? And Black Lives Matter movement, the name reparation as one of their policy goals in the United States. Now, this was supported by a lot of people, including rapper T.I. He supported reparations. He said that what they should do is give every black American $1 million and asserts that slavery caused, especially for the fact that slavery caused mass incarceration, poverty, and ills. Speaking from a man who was incarcerated, I find it to be very enlightening, especially a man who was, incarcerated and has millions of dollars. He says that no, 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 no. Forget the $170,000. They should be getting $1 million. Bottom line. Now, even with everything and all the studies that are going on and the studies that they're trying to prevent, there is still opposition to slavery reparations. It reflects the general population in a study concluded by YouGov, or YouGov, which is consisting of a great deal of people who don't look like me. But YouGov study said that only 37% of Americans believe that slavery should be provided compensation in the form of cash after being freed. He said, furthermore, only 15% believe that the descendants of slaves should receive cash payments for their findings, indicate a clear divide between blacks and whites. Now, YouGov contacted every white person and they said, should we give reparations to descendants of slaves? Well, 15% said, yeah, give them their money. Now, here's the divide. The study summarized their findings that only 6% of the white Americans supported cash payments compared to 59% of black Americans who said, yeah, we want our cheddar. I'm sorry, what's the term that the kid called it? Guap. So, truly a big divide on reparations, right? Now, 2014, in response to Ta-Nehisi Coates, an article, his book called A Case for Reparations, conservative journalist Kevin D. Williamson published an article titled The Case Against Reparations. Here's this guy who looks like he spent his whole life eating Colonel Sanders chicken in the back of a pickup truck parked next to the porch with a shotgun. But he argues that people to whom reparations are owed to are long dead. So with that, Joe Biden was more, in terms of American president, he was more blunt about racism, which leads me to think Joe Biden, a white man who says that no, racism does exist. There is this systemic racism and oppression to a group of people just solely based on their melanin, right? Vice President Kamala Harris, a woman of color, her statement, she says, I don't believe that there's any more racism in America. Okay. And this is a woman who was, a DA in California, and grew up during the era of NWA, F the police, the white police who, basically outnumbered the actual black police. She doesn't think that there's any racism. She doesn't think there's any racism. So why did she pledge a black sorority? I mean, why didn't she pledge one of the white ones? But that's a whole nother story. But President Biden, right, he's been more direct and honest about it than any of them. And when he was at the 100-year, commemorating the 100 years of the Tulsa massacre, better known as Rosewood, he called out, he said, through the years there have been members of elected office who were very public about their association and memberships with the KKK. Tim. But some attendees noted, his omission of any mention of reparations because for the survivors of the massacre of Tulsa. But he also said that um, you know even though they've sued the city and the state for compensation. And then, when he was running for office, he gave a full-throated endorsement for H.R. 40, which would create a commission to study reparation. The bill passed out of the House, right? But they asked him about that since his first introduction, which he was a senator in 1989. As candidate Joe Biden, he supported it. But his administration has yet to endorse the bill. Now, now he's president. One thing that he did was he met with the Congressional Black Caucus, who brought up the need for H.R. 40, which, of course, everybody should know by now. H.R. 40 is named after the promise of 40 acres and a mule. The promise that now symbolizes the lack of support that formerly enslaved people have received from the federal government. Now, according to Biden's conversation and some of the members of the Congressional Black Caucus, they said that, he did let them down gently. And Biden said that his biggest concern on H.R. 40 is that getting the bill passed through the Senate. I mean, and here's the thing. H.R. 40 hasn't even been scheduled for a full floor vote in the House. I mean, and there are 188 sponsors in the House. So what do we need to do to get reparations? Okay. Our biggest problem right now is the Senate, because there are 50 Republicans, 50 Democrats, and we got one Kamala Harris. So in a simple majority, Biden would win. The Democrats would win. But we've got two obstacles. First, we got a Republican who's disguised as a Democrat named, Manchin, who hasn't voted for anything. But, oh, by the way, he was in full support of us doing, an embargo of Russian oil. Why? Because his big campaign donors happen to be oil people. So now that we're not getting the fuel from Russia, we can go to those wells that have been closed up because it's not cost effective to actually pump, and they can pump that, and his constituents can make more money. Oh yeah, he's in support of that. But he wasn't in support of anything else, like the Build Back Better. He was in support of the bipartisan, in which gave a whole lot of money to a whole lot, which gave trillions of dollars to billionaires. But he wasn't in support of the bill that gives thousands of dollars to poor people. Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, assistance for child care. He wasn't in support of any of that. And then, of course, we got that other Democratic, I guess, in terms of intellectual congressional members, she's a lightweight named Christian Sinema, who thinks that, the filibuster was designed. She said, historically, the filibuster is designed, to enforce bipartisan act. No, it wasn't. The filibuster was actually designed to stop any progress and growth for people of color. The filibuster came in with the actual thing of slavery. They had to filibuster it. That's why they never passed it. That's why Lincoln had to do the Emancipation Law. Oh, the filibuster. Oh, by the way, the longest record of the filibuster was on actual voting rights. The longest record was over 24 hours by Strom Thurmond to oppose voting rights for people of color. The filibuster wasn't designed to help partisanship. It was designed to end and defeat bills for people of color to get through and to pass. So, there are two things that we need to do. All right? One, if we want to get something done now, before the midterms, they need to do a simple vote on removing the filibuster. Second thing that needs to happen is blacks historically are a no-show during midterms. Every time we get a Democratic president in there, blacks show up strong, and we showed up really great 2020 to elect Joe Biden. Showed up without a doubt, and to the point where he said, "Black people, you had my back, and I'm going to have yours." Showed up. We don't show up for the midterms. So when we don't show up for the midterms, we lose congressional seats. We lose people who will vote in our best interest. We lose people who will stand up to do what's fundamentally right rather than what's good for the corporations and the powers that be. The problem that we have with the Republican Party right now is that they no longer stand for the Republic of the United States, or the Republic therefore, or the Republic of our country. They stand for the Republic of who's giving me the biggest campaign donations. They stand for big businesses, not for little guys. If you look at it, the only policies that have been coming out of this country in the last 15 years have been by Democrats. Policies have changed. And here's the thing, 100 years to pass the Emmett Till bill, 100 years. But they can't pass the George Floyd bill. Here, you want to know why they can't pass the George Floyd bill? Because the George Floyd bill makes substantive changes. The Emmett Till bill, right? Anti-lynching bill, most of the states are already doing that. There's no big change in that. What we have to do to get reparations, what we have to do is to end a lot of this systematic oppression, redlining. What we have to do is get out and vote, and get out and vote in force. Not just the presidential election, but our local elections. All right? Which is why a lot of states right now, there are over 30 states that are drafting notions right now to gerrymander the vote. If not gerrymander the vote, control the outcome. So even though we do, if these bills pass, even though black people do show up and we do get the candidates in office, they now have the right to say no. What we have to do is get out and vote and change, make positive change. And what we have to do is stop listening to these charismatic politicians who only show up for a chicken dinner, but will actually go into Washington and work for us. God, people, aren't you sick and tired of being sick and tired of this? We have to make change. We have to get out and vote this midterm. We have to get out and vote the next election. We have to get out and vote the primaries. And we have to vet these politicians to make sure that they're doing what they're saying they're going to do. And when they do get elected, we have to hold their feet to the fire. We have to do more than just sitting down and taking it. My time's up. Thanks for watching my show. Tune in Monday. I'm Vincent Squire, and please follow me on Facebook, What You Gotta Say. Follow me on YouTube, What You Gotta Say. Like us, share your thoughts, because we always want to hear what you gotta say. If it's God's will, I'll be back Monday to express some of the important issues that affect our communities. God bless you.